The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to take part in this debate about the Shewan report into foreign trust disclosure rules. Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to hear the Labor Party, well, the remaining centrist member of the Labor Party, saying that Mr Shewan is a competent person, because that's not what his leader was saying. Nothing like it. As we see the Labor Party resorting to one of its tried and true practices, which is to try and scare people out of taking part in legitimate public debate. So they decided straight away, when Mr Shewan's name turned up, that he was in some way assisting people to avoid tax obligations offshore. Those comments turned out to be probably libellous. It wasn't actually tested in court, so we don't know whether for sure they were, but led to a humiliating apology by the Leader of the Opposition, who I might say in attacking him is showing a pattern of attacking people he disagrees with in a fairly personal way. And of course, there's a lot of people in New Zealand who disagree with the Labor Party these days because it's a shadow of its former self. And probably 7 out of every 10 people in New Zealand don't support them and do disagree with them. So that was a bit of an unfortunate start, but it's good to see the member for Napier indicating that there will be support from the Labor Party in the House for the legislation as it comes through. Mr Speaker, I think what's a striking feature of the report is the way that the report shows the context in which this issue around foreign trust disclosures can be dealt with. And I think anyone who wasn't familiar before with the wide range of activity that's now going on in New Zealand and internationally around transparency will now be familiar with it. And on that point, Mr Speaker, there's a lot of nonsense being talked about here and over recent months about so-called damage to New Zealand's reputation. If anything, what is surprising in the Panama Papers is how infrequently New Zealand is mentioned, given that the Panama Papers cover participants in tax-related activities from all around the world, including pretty well every developed country. So out of millions and millions of references, there's a handful to New Zealand, and there's a reason for that, some of which is referred to in the report, and that is that New Zealand has set as a priority the protection of its own tax base, and in pursuit of that priority has one of the tighter regimes for the taxation of companies that are and individuals that are domiciled outside New Zealand. So Mr Shewan has done a thorough investigation not just into the foreign trusts and the disclosure regime, but into the surrounding context. And I just want to talk a bit about that context, because when the House deals with the relevant bill related to this report, it will find itself dealing with quite a lot of other issues that are directly connected to it. And just by way of example, Mr Speaker, we just want to be clear about the principles that do apply, because we do have one of the more principled, consistent tax policy structures in the world, and that's been a bipartisan effort over the last 20 years or so. The basic principle is that we tax all profits earned in New Zealand, that all revenue earned in New Zealand should be reported, and any deductions should reflect actual costs of production and not be designed to reduce tax. So we focus now on really three work streams of work: making tax law more robust, increasing international cooperation, and improving transparency and exchange of information. And in that sense, the Shewan report fits into that third work stream. Because in the debate that led to the report, there was a quite misleading impression created that somehow these foreign trusts were part of some general erosion of New Zealand's tax system, that somehow the tax system was so slack that we could be designated as a tax haven, only by the Leader of the Opposition, from what I could see, not by anyone who knew anything about tax policy, including Grant Robertson. So the report says New Zealand is, quote, not a tax haven, and that is absolutely correct. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of the changes that have recently occurred. So we've reformed the CFC rules, repealing 8 country-based exemptions for non-active subsidiaries, as well as putting limits on interest costs that could be deducted in relation to outbound investment. Strengthened the thin capitalisation rules to reduce the amount of debt a foreign-controlled entity can have before interest deductions will be disallowed. These rules are also widened to capture more foreign ownership structures. Introduced bank minimum equity rules that limit interest deductions taken by foreign-owned New Zealand banks by requiring them to have a minimum amount of capital. Removed the foreign dividend exemption for deductible foreign equity, removing an opportunity for tax arbitrage between New Zealand and other jurisdictions. And just one more on this list, eliminated the conduit regime which allowed New Zealand subsidiaries controlled by foreign shareholders to flow foreign income through New Zealand without paying any New Zealand tax. Now, if they all sound a bit detailed, that's because they are. And that is because they are incremental improvements on what is, by any developed country standard, a comprehensive regime of taxing income in New Zealand of foreign domiciled companies. And there's more in the pipeline, more that's coming through. And the particular one that's relevant to this report is limiting the use of look-through companies as conduit vehicles. So this is where New Zealand companies are used by non-residents to invest in foreign markets to generate income that's not taxable in New Zealand. And certainly the advice I've seen via the Minister of Revenue is that this change, which is in the May 2016 tax bill, will have a significant impact on activities which could be regarded as offshore companies trying to avoid taxation in their own jurisdictions. So, Mr. Speaker, we endorse the recommendations of this report. Essentially what it does is make available to government agencies and enforcement authorities here and offshore the detailed information that is held by various parties to these foreign trusts. And the indication is from Mr. Shewan that making that information available to enforcement authorities will have the effect of reducing the use of foreign trusts. So that will be a good thing for offshore jurisdictions who may be concerned about the use of these vehicles in New Zealand. So, Mr. Speaker, the government in the meantime will focus on the international effort to deal with base erosion and profit shifting. There's not many, if any, measures that we can take unilaterally that are going to deal with the much broader issue, which is potentially a threat to our tax base, and that is the growing problems of jurisdiction that arise out of the use of the internet for a great deal of commerce, and the ability of what feel like the very large presence of companies like Facebook and Google to move their profits anywhere in the world that they choose. And so we are going to work with other countries through the OECD, where I might say there's surprising degree of interest in a strong degree of interest in cooperation, for the simple reason that almost all developed country governments are keen to have revenue. and they've been losing it. This report is going to assist them to some extent, but we will certainly continue to focus on maintaining New Zealand's tax base.
The time for this debate has expired. I understand it's the government's intention to introduce an impress supply bill.
Supply first for 2016-17 bill, introduction.
This bill is set down for first reading forthwith.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the Mr. Speaker, I move that the impress supply first for 2016-17 bill be now read a first time.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Impress supply first for 2016-17 bill, first reading.
This bill is set down for second reading forthwith. I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.